So as soon as you are incapacitated, you should really let your insurer know in writing as soon as possible. Even if that is a lengthy deferred period, the sooner they get to know about this, then the sooner they can start putting into action the steps they need to justify the claim and to make sure that the claim can be met in a prompt and tidy fashion. So most companies will issue notification timescales. In other words, if you've got a 3-month deferral period, they'll want notifying after 4 weeks, and that's the way it will generally work. Now, notification during the deferred period is advised, as we just said, to allow time for all the GP paperwork to be done, and also allowing for prompt payment as soon as the deferred period essentially expires. Once you return to work, of course, then your benefits are going to stop. So benefits will be paid until you return to work. There's some agreed rehabilitation process. The policy expires, or alternatively you die. Generally speaking, there's no death benefits in an income protection plan. Now, one of the things that is important is to understand the impact of linked periods of illness, which effectively is relapses or reoccurrences of a condition that's kept you off work and resulted in a previous claim. This can, in some cases, result in a deferred period being waived, normally subject to usual conditions and ongoing income assessments, etc. But generally speaking, if you have an ongoing condition that keeps coming back, you probably won't need to wait for the deferred period to actually expire each time if it's the same ailment. Different conditions, different story. That's likely to mean that the deferred period must be observed. Of course, one thing you always need to factor in now is that you cannot be paid the insurance if you're being paid by your employer. So if your employer is generous, then not having a deferred period on your insurance is probably meaningless. I think it's usual exclusions time, really. Whenever considering the stuff where you will not be paid money out, there's some obvious ones. Alcohol, drug abuse, criminal acts, unnoted hazardous pursuits, failure to follow medical advice, anything to do with pregnancy and complications regarding that. Even living abroad can also be an exclusion, and there can be impacts regarding foreign residence and travel on these particular insurance plans. In fact, we're going to look at that in a bit more detail on the next page. So hopefully we're getting to know this now, that all insurances are going to have very similar exclusions attached to them that you'll need to actually make sure that you assess. So, foreign residence and travel. The benefits are only payable while insured people essentially are permanent residents within certain key locations. And this is known as free limits, really. And the countries that you would have no problem with are likely to be the UK, the European Economic Area, most of the Western world, America, Australia, etc. And essentially, if you are working abroad in one of these countries, you're probably going to be covered, but there's probably going to be some kind of restriction on the amount of time that you will be paid benefits, maybe 3 to 6 months. And it's common if you're overseas for a long period of time to see your cover suspended or even cancelled in certain circumstances. So non-disclosure of information is essentially really important to understand, and the impact that this is likely to have. We've talked about the onus being on the insurance company to request the right information. So an insurance company cannot simply have an application form that says anything you want to tell us about in relation to your health. They must ask specific questions that they would need to determine your mortality rate. So they should ask specific questions around each main health issue and each main area of financial medical history, generally speaking. So the onus is on the applicant to answer the questions that are asked correctly and honestly, which is utmost good faith, but the onus is on the insurance company to ask the right questions. Now, if there's a minor infringement, that is not necessarily going to invalidate the contract. In other words, if you provide a date that you've had a blood pressure read and it's 12 months out, that's unlikely to create any problems whatsoever. But anything more major than that, you might have a problem. So we're going to look on the next slide at the non-disclosure categories that the Association of British Insurers have essentially created in terms of what it might mean for a non-disclosure, whether or not it is reasonable, whether it's careless, or whether it's considered to be deliberate or reckless in its nature. And you can imagine that each of these categories are going to have different outcomes likely in the event of it coming to light that the information is not correct. Only applicable really if the non-disclosure makes a material difference to the insurance. In other words, it has to also meet a general criteria that any non-disclosure must be material and actually would have had a significant impact on the ability to get insurance in the first place.